Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Ask Us Anything, CMMC Office Hours with Redspin and Zscaler. My name is Monica Pastor, and I'm the Senior Events Marketing Manager here at Redspin, and I'll be your host for today. We're excited to have you with us. So whether you're just beginning your CMMC journey, actively preparing for an assessment, or simply trying to make sense of the latest developments, today's session is designed for you. As many of you know, there has been a great deal of discussion recently surrounding the temporary pause in CMMC Level 2 certifications and assessments. So we know many organizations have questions about what this means for their compliance timelines, ongoing preparation efforts, and future contracts. So you're certainly not alone in wondering what comes next. So rather than speculate, we've assembled experts who are actively working in this space every day. We know this topic is top of mind, and we'll be addressing questions around the recent pause during our Q&A portion of today's session. So if you're wondering how this affects your organization, please stay with us and submit your questions throughout the webinar. All right, a few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's webinar is being recorded, and everyone who registered will receive the recording afterwards. Throughout today's session, please submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A feature. We've already had some excellent questions pre-submitted during registration, but we encourage you to keep those coming. This is intentionally designed to be an interactive session, so the more questions you ask, the more valuable today's session will be for everyone. So if you also want to ask your question live, you can raise your hand once we get to that live Q&A section and come off mute and ask your question. So today's session flow will be structured. We'll talk through some recent assessment trends first. Then Jeff from Zscaler will talk us through how Zero Trust Exchange controls line up against key CMMC practice families. And then we'll start answering your pre-submitted questions and your live questions. So with that, let's meet our speakers for today. Jeffrey, would you kick us off with some introductions? Tell us a little bit more about your background and Zscaler, and then we'll go to Ned and Stephanie.
Okay. For some reason, I feel like I'm on like a speed dating. Like I gotta get through this. But hey, everybody, Jeffrey Adorno. You kind of see a little bit about my experience. 21 years in the Army, retired. I worked alongside network security. You know, a full range of the spectrum of cybersecurity. Now I've been with Zscaler for 5 years, and something what we call is field compliance, where it's more of a customer compliance practice where we work with you to align Zscaler capabilities to your compliance requirements. Thank you.
Ned?
Ned Butler. I'm a lead CCA with Redspin. I've been with Redspin since December of 2024. Prior to joining Redspin, I was actually on the OSC side, or end of the field, um, leading CMMC and compliance programs. So I've been living NIST 800-171, DFARS 7012 since 2016, and CMMC since it was first announced. Can't remember if it was November of 2020 or 2021. So I'm able to bring to our assessments an OSC perspective.
Awesome. Thanks, Ned. Stephanie?
Hi, I'm Stephanie Kincaid. I've been with Redspin for going on 4 years now, I think. It feels like forever. And I also came from the implementation side of the house early on in my career. I've worked with SCADA systems, and RMF was my first go around with the compliance thing. um, and yeah, I'm a lead CCA with Redspin now, and so I've seen a lot. I worked on the consulting side as well as the assessment side, so seen a lot of people's pain points.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephanie. All right, so going into some assessment trends we're seeing in the field. So while every organization is unique, there are definitely patterns beginning to emerge. So Ned and Stephanie, from your perspective as a lead assessor, what trends have you noticed across recent CMMC Level 2 assessments? Ned, we'll start with you.
Okay. There's been a number. The first one, and I'll go all the way back to the beginning of assessments on this one, just because I think it's been an interesting pattern in the assessments that I've seen. I'd say, probably through last year, from January through late summer, assessments, the clients that we were assessing were very well prepared. which was the opposite of what I would have thought. I would have thought we would have seen unprepared clients then, but these were the early adopters to CMMC. Then I'd say, the latter part of last year, we started seeing some less prepared OSCs come into the environment for assessment. Um, they started to see the light and say, hey, we better get on board here, but maybe schedule their assessment a little early. And then over this past year, we've seen a gradual improvement in the quality of the assessments and the preparedness, particularly companies that have taken advantage of, a third party mock assessment. And then it was interesting for a few months there while people were, that November 10th, 2026 date, everyone thought, viewed as like a deadline. I have to rush and get assessed and certified by that date, which wasn't entirely true. So we did start seeing another round of unprepared clients, come in for assessment. But I think, now we're probably going to see that upward trend in better preparedness again.
Stephanie, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, the for the most part, like Ned said, we started out seeing everybody ready. They were scared, it was brand new. Then everybody's like, oh wait, we're changing CMMC again and this and that. Is it really going to be real? And then they had people procrastinating. And then again, jumping right back into it. Then we also have, because of that, OSCs may think they're ready. And then we get in there in the phase one and we recognize they're not ready. And one of the biggest things that they think is, oh, we've been doing this, for so long, but they're not nearly as ready as they thought. Their documentation is usually the biggest catcher. Like they may have all of the technical pieces in place, but they seem to sometimes forget about the documentation. And so therefore they're not nearly as ready as they think. And hopefully we try and catch that in phase one. But at times we may make it to phase two and recognize that they may have an SSP, policies and procedures, but they don't always cover the entire scope of the assessment or, things like that.
If I could jump in really quick and just ask a question to that, there's been everyone knows there's been like this wave of everybody rushing and then not rushing to stutter step. When you see that an OSC is not as prepared as they should be, is that because would you assume that they're like trying to sequence when exactly to schedule it versus being prepared and then scheduling it? Like, are they putting the cart before the horse as it relates to scheduling? And then they just feel committed to just get it done because they've already have it on the calendar.
Well,
Any
I've
thoughts?
definitely seen of that. So, and it's partly, I feel, due to the fact that there's only so many C3PAOs out there. And everybody's scared that, oh, if I don't get on the books, then I'm not going to have my chance. And
Mm,
so they schedule an assessment and they think, well, we'll get all this documentation, we'll get everything implemented by the time it happens, and then it doesn't. Real life happens. They're super busy with their day jobs, and it gets slid down the line, and then they're like, oh no, and they're not ready. I think that is one thing I've seen. Ned's probably seen similar
yeah.
as well. Another.
Right. And, sometimes that's resulted in, what we'll call, a false start, where, the evidence that they provided us for the phase one readiness review, just wasn't adequate or sufficient to proceed to phase two. Other times I've seen them ready for a phase, the the evidence is sufficient,
Mhm.
adequate, sufficient, and we move to phase two, and they're not prepared for the interviews. That maybe they brought, they have one person who's going to be a proxy for all the actual control performers who are the people we should actually be talking to. Then we have this one proxy who's trying to answer for all 14 domains. And that can make, maybe they haven't gone through a mock assessment. A mock assessment's a great rehearsal to understand what that phase two is going to be like. And it helps your team prepare for the types of answers they're going to be asked. Um,
Mhm.
So when they haven't been that prepared and they've kind of rushed themselves to assessment, um, more often than not, we make it through phase two, but it's a very bumpy ride through phase two. There have been a couple times where we have, at least in my experience, where an assessment has been halted.
Same.
If I could do one more follow up just to all of that. So in the scenario that there's this like single proxy, single point of failure, does that also like lower your confidence of that program? Or like any thoughts on that?
It can, but not always. Particularly when
Okay.
you're talking with a smaller organization where,
Oh yeah, true.
right? Maybe it's a 2 or 3 person IT department. And one of those people, maybe their IT manager is that proxy, right? He's
Mhm.
probably familiar enough to be dangerous. Um, but maybe there are things that he or she should not be speaking on, like, personnel security and trying to discuss, your screening process. If HR is involved in that process, maybe they're more appropriate.
True.
Maybe the facility manager for physical and environmental protection could get us through our questions and our walkthrough a lot faster than if it's just the IT manager.
So I was just gonna say we try to caution our OSCs up front to who should be expected to speak, but they don't always understand or don't always follow through.
Excellent point. All right, now we're going to transition into Zscaler. So, one of the questions we hear frequently is how zero trust technologies actually support CMMC compliance in practice. So, to help answer that, let's spend the next few minutes looking at how Zscaler capabilities map to CMMC requirements. So, Jeff, I'll turn that over to you.
Yeah, and again, really quick, I think I'm more interested in Redspin, maybe because I do this day to day with Zscaler. But when we start to look at zero trust and FedRAMP or anything NIST based, NIST compliance based, it is a team of teams approach, right? From the IDP all the way down to the application to your SIEM. It is a comprehensive cybersecurity program that you have to keep in mind. So with that said, is number one, Zscaler is not an IDP, but we can leverage your ABAC and your PBAC to create something what we call as context-based access control. So not only can we consume the attributes from your identity provider, but then because we're centrally located within your network and have API integrations, we can then pull in those signals, pull in the other attributes of that traffic to say, no, we're gonna allow, we're gonna disallow, we're gonna maybe quarantine you or even put you into an isolated environment. That is zero trust. Zero trust is not a one or a zero. It's an aggregated way of pulling in different signals to say, I still need to enable the business. I still need to enable functionality. How do I do that in the most secure, modern way to do that? So when you look at Zscaler, we could look at our mapping as we're going to see right here. And even if we were to break this down into a zero trust model, we have capabilities while we're traditionally, air quote, traditionally seen as this network pillar capability. We actually have features and functions that across the board, we integrate with your IDP, we integrate with your endpoint to do device posture checks, so on and so on and so on. So much so that we are a policy enforcement point. We have a centrally managed policy enforcement management console. And from a OSC or CMMC perspective, that centrally managed location, centrally managed and enforced policy with the evidence of enforcing security then becomes combined with microsegmentation, then becomes this bread and butter of, hey, I have this single tool that can meet many different use cases. And you can kind of go 2 slides more, one more. So this is what I would call out because yes, traditional compliance is going to look at, do you meet this control? And we can answer the mail on that. But I think people are more interested and more concerned now that the dust has settled with CMC to what is the capability that I'm going to buy and how is it going to impact my day to day, right? A buddy of mine said something about a different capability that just giving away their stuff free like a puppy. Well, it's free now, but you got to do the caring, the feeding, the walking, and maybe you just didn't think about that. You just saw it from a dollar perspective instead of a lifestyle perspective. You have to live with this. And that's why we like to also approach it from a use case perspective. We have capabilities like branch connector that has SD-WAN or device segmentation to support, you know, excuse me, headless IoT, OT use cases, but then workload to workload. We have zero trust cloud. Moving forward, unmanaged device use cases. So BYOD or even third party. We have different ways to skin that cat where you say, I have the operational flexibility with a platform centrally managed to provide comprehensive coverage. And that's what you're seeing here. With that, I'll turn over the mic. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Ned or Steph, do you have any observations that you want to share about assessments using Zscaler?
Ned, do you want to go first? Or you want me to?
So
I want to overtalk.
I have worked with Zscaler on the OSC side. I have not yet assessed a Zscaler environment, but I came to love Zscaler when I was on the OSC side. One story I'll tell. Although my focus was CMMC when COVID hit. Um, I worked for a large organization. We had 55,000 employees, and everyone was sent to work remotely. Um, you know, my concern was split tunneling. My selfish, NIST 800 171 concern was that how do we comply with the split tunneling um, requirement. And of course, our networking folks were more concerned about capacity management, backhauling all that traffic back through our data center and out to the internet, through our VPN. And that's where Zscaler came in for us. We deployed ZIA to all the endpoints. There was an article or a white paper that Ryan Bonner and crew had put together about how zero trust address um, can address split tunneling, and so that convinced me that okay, we're good. We're going to be compliant here. And so rather than backhauling, we had control over our Zscaler tenant, so that was part of our boundary. So that was not split tunneling to me.
Mhm.
We were routing directly through a more local POP, right? Rather than going all the way back to our data center. So that's, where Zscaler first came to the rescue for me.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point is I've seen different OSCs think to themselves, okay, I need to have one set of capabilities and boxes, hardware to support the enterprise, a different set for the enclave, and then what? How else am I going to manage, my remote users, my alternate work site users? And that's the point of that. I try to drive home is with this comprehensive platform, it's just one policy that you're applying everywhere, right? I'm curious. I know you provide sharing your OSC experience. Were you with them during this actual CMMC assessment? Like, how did the CCA or C3PAO? What was their experience?
There's someone else on the call that could better tell you. I left the OSC prior
Oh.
to their assessment, but there may be someone on this call that
So, so I have actually been on both sides. I have assessed clients with Zscaler, and I really enjoy doing so. And then I've also been on the consulting side, basically sitting on the same side of the table as our OSCs, helping to articulate to the assessors how Zscaler, helps with meet some of these controls. The biggest thing that I have seen, like across the board on both sides, from a OSC or sitting on the consulting side, speaking to a C3PAO, is that all C3PAOs are not created equally. All CCAs are also not created equally. That's kinks are getting worked out, guys. I know it's going to get better. But currently, what you see is the CCAs don't always understand the technology.
Yep.
And so then it's
Mhm.
on the OSC and or the consultant's responsibility, so to speak, to be able to convince them. While you may not have a checkbox in a firewall that says split tunneling is disabled, you have to be prepared to articulate to them, just as Ned did, as to why you're not going to see that checkbox, because they're
Mhm.
not always going to understand the technology. I also know from experience that the Zscaler team they have actually come to the rescue, especially when I very first um, started assessing clients that have implemented Zscaler. They're quick to answer their OSCs. They're quick to help articulate how Zscaler actually meets the intent of the controls. The VPN one is a big one. The next one is like the always on VPN, and the fact of how the traffic is actually being routed and how Zscaler is performing um, the capability to protect data in transit, as well
Mhm.
as, house and like where's your access points and all that kind of good stuff. And so I've seen it, like I said, both ways. Me being the assessor from the C3PAO, I'm excited to see it, because I don't necessarily, while I will ask for the artifacts, that's our job, we have to, even if I know how it works, especially if it's a configurable line item, I'm going to have to ask the OSC to show me that artifact. I,
Mhm.
in my mind, might know where it's at, but I still have to ask for them to do so. Um, so yeah, but it
Mhm.
is definitely across the board, been a great product from my experience.
And the punchline for those who are wondering, the OSC did successfully achieve CMMC level 2
That's a good point. I totally forgot.
using the Zscaler platform.
Yeah.
So before we open the floor to live questions, we'd like to address several pre-submitted questions during registration. So Jeff, this first one's for you. What advantages does Zscaler offer compared to other security platforms such as CrowdStrike?
Okay. I wasn't prepared. You got me on the hot seat. You know, well, that feels like a loaded question. First of all, what I would offer to the broader team is, well, Zscaler doesn't look at CrowdStrike as competition. We both have two different focuses, and while some capabilities might overlap, we have our eye on the ball from a different vantage point. Zscaler's bread and butter is going to be from a SASE perspective. Yes, we do have some endpoint components. Yes, we do. We acquired Red Canary, which is an MDR, but we also have integrations with CrowdStrike. I would not. Yeah, I don't know. It's like apples and oranges. Yeah, so we're both fruit, but maybe you pick one, for a different purpose. The advantage of CrowdStrike would be their focus, right? It's very endpoint focused. The advantage of Zscaler is, again, our comprehensive approach, but also we are extremely focused on implementing that reverse proxy, that zero trust architecture. We are an architectural platform. We're centrally managed into your network, right? Everything else is seeded from that. So it's hard for me to answer. I don't know.
Yeah, and I look at CrowdStrike and Zscaler, except for maybe the 10% overlap in capabilities, as complementary. Two
Mhm.
tools in your toolbox.
Yes.
Can also attest that in my experience assessing, it is very common actually to see both of the products implemented. So while, like Jeff and Ned were saying, CrowdStrike has its strong points, such as EDR and a lot of
Mhm.
endpoint management and monitoring, right? Where I notice a lot of the controls being answered with Zscaler is more network level. So
Mhm.
they really of course, they work well together. Honestly, I think both are very good products.
Yeah. If I could throw one more thing out there, I mean, great point, Stephanie, is even for Zscaler's CMMC level 2, right? We're certified with over a year now. We actually, well, we drink our own champagne, and we also leverage CrowdStrike as part of our CMMC package. So again, we complement each other, not conflict with each other.
Thanks, team. Moving on to the second pre-submitted question. This one is a little bit longer, so bear with me as I read it, but this is always put out as a podcast after, so I do need to read it verbatim. So, is Redspin seeing AEC companies successfully implement CMMC Level 2 compliant VDI environments for CAD workflows involving CUI? And if so, what would an assessor expect to see when assessing that architecture? Follow-up question. Many firms remain skeptical because past VDI-based CAD implementations struggled with performance, and there are few documented real-world examples. With newer FedRAMP authorized CAD solutions and GPU-enabled virtual desktop technologies, has the viability of this approach materially improved in practice? Ned, can we start with you?
Sure. So as far as my current experience seeing this in the wild or in the field, I've not come across this yet, to be quite honest. I have seen AutoCAD out there, but more in an on-prem using higher performing workstations, high performance workstations, and the like. Um, we're probably the wrong people to ask about whether you know CAD workflows would run successfully on GPU enabled VDI. Probably a reseller, versus let's say Azure HPC. That we're not the right people to ask that. But as far as how we as a PAO, um, would look at this during an assessment, my interest is going to be drawn to that VDI and why are you using the VDI in the first place? And my belief is being led to you're trying to descope your endpoint from your CUI environment. You're trying to contain, all your CAD workflows that involve CUI in that enclave. Um, if that's the case, and you're using what I'm going to be interested in is if you're using Autodesk for government, the FedRAMP cloud solution to, it's kind of your back end to your AutoCAD processes. I'm going to want to see, is your endpoint truly separated from that enclave? Meaning, can you access that that cloud, that FedRAMP cloud environment from your endpoint versus VDI? Right? Because if you're accessing it from that endpoint, then your endpoint is not out of scope. And interestingly enough, that's a place where Zscaler will shine. Because you have the Zscaler agent deployed to that endpoint, you can block access to that cloud environment, that FedRAMP cloud environment from that endpoint, whether they're on network or off network.
Yeah. Well, thank you for tagging me back in. But Ned, great point about like performance. For me, performance, there's a lot to unpack with just the word performance. So there's a cost, aspect of this. There's again network and equipment and all these other things, compute. And so from a Zscaler perspective, one of the solutions that we would recommend, because we see this within higher ed a lot, and we even see it within like the aerospace and defense. We have something called a zero trust branch. It's like a SD-WAN capability that'll allow anyone really to connect that CAD equipment directly to that VDI farm in in a NIST 800 171 compliant, FedRAMP compliant, authorized manner, right? I mean, I think you're spot on. And could you expand on even just that environment? How does what would you recommend on like assessing the environment that CAD is located?
Well, again, I'm looking at. Oh, go ahead, Stephanie. Why don't you jump in on
Oh,
this?
that's I didn't want to speak over anyone. So from an assessor perspective, I 100% agree that it's going to be tough to pull those endpoints out of scope. And that Zscaler could sit on top of that and work with answering some of these controls. And I have actually commonly worked with our MSS department when implementing such hybrid environments where they do have a VDI solution in place, and that's for, their primary workforce or whatever the case may be. And then they do have those like a small handful, say, endpoints that are in scope. And the way it works, I mean, it could be multiple different ways, of course, you guys already know to
Hmm.
have that connection. Do you address it as, an external connection? You know, Probably not if the endpoint's in scope, but um, it is definitely possible to keep those endpoints in scope and in a compliant method. And it is commonly seen because of the resources and such that's required. Sometimes it's either seriously expensive or latency, and it's just hard to implement in the virtual infrastructure. I don't know if that was tied into what you guys are saying or what, but
Yes.
from that perspective, I
Thank you.
think that's, you know.
Yeah, all that, we're not assessing that AutoCAD
Mm-mm.
installation correctly. It's inheriting most, it's part of that endpoint that it's running on, or part of that, server or whatever it's running on, and it's inheriting a lot of those controls from that endpoint. So we're really kind of focused on, well, how does the user using that piece of software get access to the CUI that they're going to process in that software, right? So those are the kinds we're more focused on that than we are on the software itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. Yep.
All right. Hopefully that answers your question to the individual who submitted that one. And our last pre submitted question is any recent audit slash assessment changes to be aware of today? Well, this is a perfect segue into our next slide regarding the phase two pause. So, Ned and Stephanie, let's address the elephant in the room. Can you walk us through what organizations need to know and just as importantly, what they need to not worry about and what's next?
Well, let's talk about what the facts are, right? There's a lot of, you know, rush to judgment, conjecture, and rumor going on about it, and all we can really operate on are what are the hard facts that are out there. One, we know that the DOW on July 13th, they suspended phase two of the CMMC rollout. That was, set to take effect on November 10th, 2025, right? But it's important to keep in mind that everything from phase one that went into effect November 10th of 2025, I probably said 25 before, that's 26. Well, went into effect 2025, phase one self-assessments for FCI environments, phase two, or, the phase one self-assessment requirement for level one, the self-assessment requirement for level two for CUI environments, that is still in effect. And what, this doesn't touch at all is the DFARS 252.204.7012 requirement that's been in effect for nearly 9 years now. So, we're still held to that requirement. Um, a lot of people think that the 60-day pause, it's a 60-day pause. What it really is the Reform Task Force has 60 days to perform their review of the CMMC program and to produce their recommendations for any changes that need to be made. It's not a resolution date for the pause. Unlikely there'll be fixed decisions. It'll be recommendations for change, and then you go into the stage where you make decisions based on those recommendations. Um, Active contracts, if you're an OSC with an active contract that has a CMMC level 2 C3PAO requirement, um, those have been, rescinded. So they're going to be pulled out of any active contract or any active solicitation. So you'll just be held to the level 2 self-assessment requirement. And lastly, just to stress, this is a pause. It's not a repeal. 32 CFR 170 is unchanged. It's still in effect. To repeal needs a notice and comment rulemaking. With that, well, we'll go to Jeffrey, and then I'm going to pivot to Stephanie to provide Redspin's position.
Oh, um, you know, if I was going to provide Zscaler's position, it would be, well, everyone used, the phrase compliance is not security, security is not compliance. in no way does pausing a certification level, permit anybody to stop adhering to the NIST 800 171 that's already, codified, like you said, in the 32 CFR or even in DFARS, right? But that's from a compliance perspective. The CMMC, program has paused, but the threat has not. From a Zscaler perspective, we should always be modernizing our security foxhole. We should always be, making sure that we are securing our network and securing our business against the threats that aren't codified in some compliance framework or certification. So that's all I got.
Yeah, and I pretty much just have to pile on to what Ned said, right? Is your responsibility to protect this information is still there, right? Your obligation to protect CUI under the DFARS 7012. This suspension doesn't affect that at all. So, not to mention, like Ned said, this is a pause, not a repeal, right? And then, last but not least, I guess what I would say too, though, is think about if number one, if you've already made an investment, right, in certification, organizations that complete level 2 certification during this period, they're able to retain that certification and the market position that it provides. So even though this is probably letting OSC think, "Hey, we're off the hook," it really doesn't. It just takes the teeth away from it temporarily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna throw in another elephant in the room, that may be, a little hidden, behind the tree. Most, when we talk about preparing for assessment, let's all be honest with ourselves. Most of that preparation is actually implementing the requirements that we have been obligated to follow since December 31st of 2017. If we're being honest with ourselves, that's 90% of the work.
Right.
So Redspin's recommendation, I would say, is continue on. It takes 12 to 18 months, including, that implementation effort, um, to be ready. You still need to be compliant, so stay on your current timeline. Continue, you know, your preparation, which we know much of it is your implementation of the requirements. Um, you know, I would say that is our position, is to continue with that. Do not stop. March forward.
Absolutely. And who knows what if the requirements return with a shorter runway than the original schedule provided. So you don't know what you don't know. So we recommend to definitely not pause your compliance efforts.
All right. Thanks, team. So now we will spend the remainder of our time answering your live questions. So please send them in the chat or the Q&A. We do have one question that came in from John. I'm going to read it out loud for you guys. So with all that said, knowing we still need to adhere to NIST 800-171, can a C3PAO officially certify as of now? And as a follow-on, would it make more sense to do a gap analysis to theoretically lower cost versus a certification audit assessment? And another follow-on, if we did a certification assessment now, could it turn out after the 60-day pause? Could we be required to do another certification assessment? All that to be said is the basic question of certification assessment versus gap analysis / pre-assessment. Who wants to address that
So
one?
I'm going to go right back to one of the things I said, was that 32 CFR 170 is still in effect.
Mhm.
Okay. When we talk about phase 1 of the rollout, phase 2 of the rollout, phase 3 of the rollout, those are not 32 CFR 170. Those are the 48 CFR rule. So yes, we are still performing assessments today. We have several ongoing right now. We will be performing assessments tomorrow. We are awarding certificates. We're uploading the results in EMAS. We are having our closeout briefings with our clients. Those certifications will still be valid. Any that are done during this 60-day period will be valid after the 60-day period. Let's say worst case, which I don't want to speculate on, but let's just say that there's a worst case. At the very least, and certainly during this 60-day period, those certificates, are a really good market differentiator for OSCs. And remember, the primes are the ones these days, that are really driving this. We're all familiar with the L3 Harris, the DRS, notifications that they're sending out to their supply chain about compliance and certification with this. They're really driving this, and the DOW doesn't have a lot to say about that. It's privity of contract. So maybe the DOW during the 60 days isn't, or for a period of time after November 10th will not be looking for these certifications, but your primes very well could be, and they're valid.
Jeffrey put in the chat, even Boeing has their own push for CMMC certification.
Oh, Boeing, I mean, I can
There's
go
a
down.
whole,
I've seen
yep.
pretty much all of them.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point. Even so, Zscaler, we're an OSC. Yes, we're a vendor. But even when we're looking at business, we're looking, when the primes will say, come down with an RFI, RP, it's, are you, NIST 801 self-assessed? Do you already have a certification? I think, Ned, you're spot on. While there is a pause, just having a certification is a differentiator, right? It's saying that anybody can be biased about their own environment, but a third party assessment means something, right? It carries weight. It's credibility and its validity to actually doing the work.
All right. Stephanie, I have a question for you. Many organizations assume that because a product is FedRAMP authorized, they're automatically compliant with CMMC. Can you explain why that's not necessarily the case?
So while, I mean, there could be multiple answers to this. One is their FedRAMP assessment goes against their policies, their procedures, which is great, right? That's the requirement. But if depending on the type of FedRAMP, say if it's SaaS solution, whatever the case may be, they still have possible configuration to perform as part of, particularly around the OSC's environment. That piece has not been validated, right? And if there's ever a configurable line item, I'm going to throw this one out there, FIPS enabling, right? Their FedRAMP package goes to show that they have the capability to support FIPS. Do they have it enabled for your OSC? That's something that the assessors have to verify. So while inheritance is great and wonderful and everything like that, and the body of evidence provided as part of their FedRAMP package, you can't get offended if the assessor still asks to show evidence of certain things being implemented in that particular environment. So while, yes, that's a big, huge portion of what you need to look at during your supply chain considerations, your flow, all that kind of good stuff, yes. But don't forget that just because you have purchased this wonderful FedRAMP thing, you still have responsibility in showing how it is configured, how it works in your environment, and having evidence to support that.
Anything else to add, Jeff or Ned?
I'll jump in really quick and say, from a OSE, that's also a FedRAMP CSP. Stephanie, I wish like fire emoji, you're spot on. We leverage our own ZIA, ZPA, that's FedRAMP. We're on using FedRAMP High for our own CMMC. But again, CrowdStrike was FedRAMP authorized. While those things do mean that, yes, you've met some controls, you're right. But, your NIST 800 170 controls, 800 171 controls still need to be validated. But also, CMMC is all about need to know. Not everybody in your FedRAMP organization has need to know as it relates to CUI, right? So just being able to carve out that isolated environment for that user population, that's another component of all of this, right? It's having one is not a silver bullet, but it helps you move a lot faster to get to that certification.
Team. So we also have another topic that we'd like to talk about. So Steph and Ned and Jeff, if you'd like to chime in too, can you guys talk about the difference between phase 2 of an assessment and phase 2 of the CMMC program rollout?
Program. That is, the rollout of CMMC in, DOW contracts. So as a contract clause, um, that's really, defined by 48 CFR. But that's what these phases are about. So phase 1 was November 10th of 2025. And that was we started seeing in new solicitations, um, the requirement to perform a level 1 self-assessment and a level 2 self-assessment, of, level 1 for FCI, level 2 for CUI. Okay. November 10th of this year, 2026, that was when the requirement for CMMC level 2 C3PAO certification was going to start appearing in DOW solicitations. And then I think the next phase 3, was when we'd start seeing the level 3. So when it comes to the CMMC, phased rollout, phase 2 is, all about when certain clauses would be appearing in DoD solicitations and contracts. When it comes to an assessment phase 2, so an assessment ideally is 3 phases, but it could go to a 4th. Phase 1, is kind of a readiness review. We're reviewing your documentation, your artifacts. Phase 2 of an assessment is when we're actually face to face with you. That is the core of the assessment that we're performing. If we have any questions that arise out of our review in phase 1, we're going to ask you during these interviews. We're going to ask you to show us things. We're also going to ask you to show us things that you already gave us screenshots for in phase 1, but we need to see them live. So phase 2 is really, where things happen. And then we proceed to a phase 3, which, is really our validation of all the evidence that you've supplied and how our interviews have gone. And then we make our final determination during phase 3. Stephanie, anything to add to that?
No, you nailed it for me.
Awesome. Thanks, team. All right, Stephanie, I saw you addressing this in the chat, but I'm going to read it for everyone and then you can take it live. Would anyone be willing to comment on assessor interpretation differences? Are you seeing OSCs have success when asking assessors to clarify where in the guide they're getting their justification or going back to the C3PAO for disagreements?
So the first most important, I think, item to consider is they are the lead CCA they have leeway to ask for all sorts of things, right? It is definitely acceptable to ask them to clarify what they're asking for in a most polite and tactful way. It is your responsibility to defend your environment and to ask questions, of course, if you do not feel that they are meeting the intent of the control or whatever the case may be. And as lead assessors, we should be able to articulate where we are getting our justification from. There are some things to consider that I see commonly across the board with assessors, and I have patience with these lead CCAs because I'm guilty sometimes as well, is they may be thinking of controls ahead, right? When I'm in AC, I may accidentally ask a little bit of questions around remote access or whatever because I know it's coming down for SC. So sometimes that is what they're doing. Other times, some of them are just going down needless rabbit holes or have completely misinterpreted the intent of the control at hand. All of which are possibilities. But the good thing is they have the appeal process there for a reason. Just like you're saying, go back to the C3PAO for disagreements. The first step, right, is for that lead CCA to take it back, of course, provide you with an appeal form and all that kind of good stuff. And then take it back to their organization to go back to their team and to see whether or not they're all in agreement or whatever the case may be. And then it goes to the AB next. So while the lead CCA is there and they're the ones that's asking questions, they're not the end of the road either, right? So, and that's the reason that I have to say is working well, because we have been through this process and even had appeals go to, and I encourage it. If I find a not met somewhere, I encourage you to, appeal it if you feel the need, because I know that my notes are going to back up my thought process, and we're all human. It's not if the AB says, Stephanie, you're off base here, I don't take it personally, right? Same way if Ned were to review one of my findings, say, hey, did you think about this, right? So that's why the appeal process is there in the first place.
And I'll add 3 points, to that. One, we have had appeals, right? And we have an appeals board, and that appeals board is made up of all of our lead CCAs. And when we have gone through that process, we have actually overturned some findings, um, as a group. The lead CCA for, the assessment that's being repealed is there more as a witness and not part of the decision making. But it does happen. And Stephanie, I'm glad to hear you say that you do encourage, if they have a not met, particularly one that's going to result in a failure of the
Mhm.
assessment. Um, I also encourage um, the OSC, when I do my in brief to, appeal it. There's a lot at stake here. You're not going to lose anything by appealing it. I always tell them that I'm, saying that I'm going to get in trouble with my boss, and you used to be my boss. So I'm particularly happy to hear you say that. Uh, but number three, I want to talk about the fact that, as you said, we're human. We make mistakes, or sometimes we don't understand everything perfectly. And there have been, a few times that I can tell you during an assessment, where I saw it one way. Um, the OSC saw it another way, or more often than not, their RPO, who's helping them through this assessment, saw it. Um, and if I'm open minded. I give you every opportunity to put your best foot forward. I'm going to listen to you. If you come with a structured response to why you disagree with me, I'm going to listen to that. And honest to God, several times I have said, I hadn't thought about it that way. You're absolutely right. Let me take that into consideration, and I'll talk to you the next, in our next in brief, and I'll do that research, that night. Yes, do it. So,
Yeah. And this is my famous saying, right? I say this all the time. It is not our job to place bias on what you define, right? So our job, and like Laura has said in the chat, new assessors are looking at it more of an auditor versus assessor. There's a difference between an assessment and an audit. Our job is to read your documentation and verify that you are doing what you say you're doing, and test do you have the evidence to support it? It's not our job to go outside of those bounds. And you know, there's a lot of assessors out there. Unfortunately, Laura, we see the same thing too. But it's totally okay to defend your stance.
yeah, I don't know if I'm channeling History of the World Part One or Python, but this isn't the Inquisition. It's an assessment.
I think we have time for one more final question. How do you convince executive leadership that investing in CMMC compliance is worth the cost? Final thoughts here.
Tough one. Last one's a tough one.
I wish I had the 32 CFR regulation when I was doing that. Fortunately, I did. It took some work, but I was able to get our executive leadership on board. Um, but I think that 32 CFR 170 rule, talking about affirming official, talking about who that affirming official should be, someone with decision making and budgetary control, which points to an executive. So pointing those things out in that regulation should help. Um, understanding, having them understand that in the False Claims Act, there's a long list of them now. We have a track record now, and we're seeing, penalties. Um, Use that and just say, if you get a false claims uh, complaint against you, you affirming official are on the hook. It's a lot like Sarbanes-Oxley, right? Um, the executive leadership is on the hook for that representation under Sarbanes-Oxley. It's the same thing, with CMMC.
Yeah, and just to pile on to what he said is trying to get support and buy-in sometimes means just helping them to understand. They don't understand the regulations necessarily in depth, but maybe even showing them in black and white reports from, a mock assessment or a gap assessment and showing them, hey, this is not myself saying that we're not met here. Do we really, like Ned said, want to chance the False Claim Act? Sometimes if they see that, in my experience, they've really changed their mind a little bit.
And then one last thing, and this is, all right, I didn't have 32 CFR 170, but I had this, try and, align, show the benefits of this compliance to business objectives. Try to find a way to
Right.
align them, right? Um, when working with our engineers, engineers, they know better than everyone, right? Um, but so rather than try to convince them that, you have to, follow this clean desk policy, right? Um, well, this is your hard work. You put a lot of effort into coming up with that design. How would you feel if someone stole that for free and, started building your widget over here for half the price? What is the cost to the business? If that information, if you're not going to think about it at a national security level, certainly think about it as a business proprietary level. So, I try to, maybe they're a lot more sensitive to the impact of business. So let's align it to that.
Yeah, and if I could jump in, and like the one thing about CMMC is that it had a carrot to win, winning business, and then it had a stick of losing business. But to your point about from that business perspective, a CISO and even a CFO will completely understand risk from a cost and a security perspective to the business itself. So I think you're spot on. Yeah.
Agree. Agree. Very good point.
All right. Well, we are at time now. I'd like to sincerely thank you, Jeffrey, Ned, and Stephanie, for sharing your expertise and answering so many of everyone's thoughtful questions. So, everyone will receive today's recording along with some additional resources following the webinar. And thank you again for everyone spending part of your day with us. Hope you have a wonderful afternoon. And we hope to see you later this month on July 30th for Redspin's next CMMC Connect. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you, everybody.